Fedor Dostoevsky, Chapter 3. Dostoevsky's erratic travels in Germany, France, and Switzerland, where he went to escape from his debtors and to try his luck at roulette, left him each time as wretched and homesick as Prince Mishkin in The Idiot, full of yearning for Mother Russia. Europe, this quote-unquote beautiful cemetery, filled him with fear. Certain aspects of the London World's Fair 1851 created in him foreboding of an oncoming world disaster of biblical dimensions, akin to the terrifying sense of doom which the apostles felt when they heard Jesus' prophecy about the fate of Jerusalem's splendor. The civilization of cities, those cities which Rilke later called quote-unquote disordered and dissolved, and in particular modern industrialism, frightened Dostoevsky. He regarded both as the signs of another fall of man. London was the new Babylon, and the accumulation of wealth and power there was to him a symbol of man's rebellious pride against God. Dostoevsky gave his pessimism an apocalyptic note when he said that the end of the world was approaching, and the, quote, end of this century would be seen in disorders as never before, close quote. 40 years before the outbreak of the First World War, he was convinced that Europe stood on the brink of a moral and political catastrophe, a collapse, quote, that will be without exception general and terrible. This ant heap without a church and Christianity is already practically undermined. The fourth estate, parentheses, the lower class, close parentheses, is rising. It will smash the door. Catholicism, having ceased to be Christian, is turning into pagan idolatry. Protestantism is fast approaching atheism, close quote. He couched his accusations in vehement terms. Quote, there is no more universal idea. Everything is flabby, vapid. All people are vapid. We all are empty, close quote. Such ultimate visions of this expressed by Shigalov, one of the characters in The Possessed, are all the more uncanny because we have since witnessed the actual decomposition of society in Central Europe. We are unfortunately in a position to realize the prophetic truth of Dostoevsky's conclusions. Over 80 years ago, he predicted that the unbridled freedom, that's kind of funny, just my side note here, because the way you say bridle in Latin is freum. So the unbridled freedom is kind of like the unfreum libertà. I don't know, kind of weird. Okay, over 80 years ago, he predicted that the unbridled freedom of the individual would be replaced by despotism in the future synthetic society. 1/10 of mankind would rule over the other 9/10. 1/10. 1/10 of 1/10. Sorry. Who would lose all individual personality and become a kind of working herd, quite in accord with the visions of the Grand Inquisitor and Nietzsche. This elite body of supermen is precisely the group which, according to the Grand Inquisitor, is alone capable of, quote-unquote, bearing freedom. These are the supermen of whom the devil says to Ivan Karamazov, quote, a single soul like that weighs as much as a whole astronomical system. We have our own arithmetical scale, close quote. Raskolnikov, the murderer, becomes an early forerunner of this evil gospel when he divides mankind into ordinary and extraordinary people and quote-unquote sentences to death the pawnbroker, his first victim. But it was not only Europe that appeared doomed. Dostoevsky had also his specific fears for Russia's future. Everywhere in Europe he had met uprooted fellow countrymen who were rushing about as aimlessly as he was himself, haunted and restlessness, or living as political fugitives and waiting for tomorrow's revolution. They were the, quote, rats getting off the sinking ship, close quote. Dostoevsky felt for them only pity and indignation. They did not know how to behave in public. They spoke in a loud manner when they ought to have been silent. They were incapable of politeness or simple, natural behavior when such was expected of them. Their belief that the West could ever become their spiritual home was fallacious. They had fled from Russia's future golden age when Asia might yet become Russia's main outlet. They were Derasines. But such asides about Russia were brief, and Dostoevsky's passionate anger was mainly directed against Europe. Her great powers would be destroyed. The moral substance of that continent was worn out and undermined by the repressed democratic urges of the poor and exploited, whereas Russia still possessed an inexhaustible reservoir of strength in her plain and unbroken people. A rather optimistic view taken with the full knowledge of the suppression of the poverty rampant in Russia. Turgenev had dismissed his own countrymen as barbarian, amounting to literally nothing in the world's cultural and industrial progress. But Dostoevsky, in spite of dark foreboding, believed firmly in Russia's spiritual mission for the world. The very future of Europe would belong to Russia. There were, to be sure, contradictions in this sweeping condemnation of Western nations. Dostoevsky was generous and forgiving towards sinners and criminals, but harsh in his thinking as a nationalist. Such limitations recall the aging Tolstoy, whose artistic genius had blinded him to the realities of the world he set out to reform. The weird mixture of prophecy, fear, condensation, and outright hate for Western civilization, his dark pain and anger came from the same psychological wounds from which always he had long suffered. To his dying day, he deeply resented the application of the epithet Asiatic to his own country and its civilization. When shortly before his death he appealed to the Russian people to turn to Asia, parentheses, quote, Asia will be our civilization, close quote, close parentheses. This call carries the fury of an enormous resentment. Asia, so he thought, would supply the means and resources for ruling the world, an idea disquieting in our generation as much as his claims for Russia's messianic role. Dostoevsky had seen the signs of decay everywhere in Germany, France, and Switzerland, but he lacked the historic perspective to do justice to the great ideas of individual freedom rising to those nations and to the role of reason in religion and politics. He thought in terms of anonymous mass man, the man of tomorrow, and endowed him lavishly with the mystical qualities of a collective soul that would be the medium of a superpersonal and divine will. The individual would be carried along in the stream of time and events like grains of sand rolling on the banks and beaches of the future. Bakunin's attack upon Europe was couched in terms of political anarchism, but when Dostoevsky speaks of Europe's middle classes, he calls them stupid, ignorant, bored, mediocre, and cheating. Europe's moribund Catholicism was worse than atheism. He extended his verdict on Europe's quote-unquote tottering society to liberalism in religion and politics, both of which he considered mere symptoms of decay. Liberalism, he believed, could produce only skepticism, atheism, and political nihilism. It is significant that Verkhovensky, the typical liberal in The Possessed, had a nihilistic son, and Ivan Karamazov, the rationalist and atheist, was the seducer of his half-witted brother who murdered his father. In retrospect, we can now readily see the truth in some of his diagnosis. We also know that the unconscious and unawakened mind of the Russian masses was no alternative to the excesses of continental liberalism. The real solution to Europe's ills was, and still is, not to return to paternalism and Orthodox tradition, but the development of a responsible and self-disciplined sense of freedom under the guidance of Christian faith. Dostoevsky's thinking of a man in quote-unquote we terms was typically Russian and Slavic. As Bakunin had said, quote, I do not want to be I, I want to be we. See, if you would have done my own little note here, me and we, because me is we, flipped upside down. Anyways, and the unconscious claims for individual rights remained alien to Dostoevsky also. In fairness to him, it must also be admitted, however, that much of his criticism was justified. The European intelligentsia had, in effect, proudly detached themselves from the masses and become Terracinis, and had lost touch with their own people. A generation after Dostoevsky, and too late to retrieve what had been lost, Maurice Maeterlinck made the remarkable statement that the thinker continues to think justly only as he does not lose contact with those who do not think at all. And in our own time, Julian Benda's sensational book about treason on the intellect, parentheses, La Tahassin des Clercs, close parentheses, raises the same reproach against the ivory tower existence of the highly educated. Needless to say, events of our own time have confirmed the truth of much of Dostoevsky's diagnosis. History has spoken a harsh verdict on Europe's civilization. In retrospect, it is, however, of more than historical interest to remember that most of the truly enlightened or democratic leaders of France, Germany, England, and Denmark came from the intelligentsia and the middle classes. Even revolutionaries like Karl Marx, Lassalle, Engels, and the other Liebknecht spoke out against their own middle class with more political authority than Dostoevsky himself. Russia's own bourgeois produced historians and social reformers who chastised their fatherland for its brutality and backwardness with more detachment than Dostoevsky's nationalist fervor had ever allowed him to do. Alexander Herzen, the exiled rebel, wrote in 1851 that the European chaos would be accelerated by Russia, his fatherland, which he spoke of as, quote, a hostile, threatening state, an impatient heir ready to accelerate its slow death, close quote. Dostoevsky seems to speak from a robust nationalism without noting the voices of revolutionaries and historians who foresaw Russia's great mission for Europe's future with no less fervor than he. In their mind, Russia's victory over Napoleon in 1812 had established their undisputable claim to determine Europe's future destiny. Chadaev declared in 1830 that Russia had not yet given anything to humanity. All her energies were as yet in reserve, and in the future she would lead mankind. Such dreams revived the peculiar mystique expressed in Tchutchkev's poem 1860, which proclaimed that Russia cannot be understood or measured with a common yardstick. One must believe in Russia. Dostoevsky shared this belief with Pushkin, and both were convinced that Russia's unique genius was her ability to understand Western civilization by intuition, ex oriente lux. In 1836, 1 year before his death, Pushkin had written that Russia was Europe's court of arbitration. The Russians were to be the great and unprejudiced judges with their, quote, healthy sense of realities about everything that is not happening to us, close quote, parentheses, close parentheses. Russian Christendom, free from Western skepticism and flabby liberalism, held an enormous reservoir of spiritual power in her people. Dostoevsky's famous speech in honor of Pushkin's elaborated on the poet's thought by stating that the whole Russian nation not only had the ability to understand the spirit of other nations, but also the urge to be the future reconciler. To be a true and genuine Russian meant to be a brother to all men. The historic speech also envisioned the future fraternal union of all people according to the laws of Christ. These are the major claims. I've got to make sure it's still recording. I have a weird one. These are the major claims, which are all the more uncanny in light of recent events in Europe and Asia. Dostoevsky was opposed to socialism and dictatorship, yet he has substantially contributed to the nationalistic fanaticism that saved Russia from Hitler, but has since been employed by her rulers for enlarging Russian imperialism, just as the nationalism of 1870s and 1880s was accustomed to drape itself in the garb of divine mission. It is more than a coincidence that one of the forefathers of German nationalism, a poet, Ernst Arndt, had preached an equally fervent and religious patriotism decades before Germany had even been united. Arndt advocated a universalism quite similar to that of the Russians. As early as 1843, he also called the German citizen a citizen of the world, a universal man, quote, to whom God has given the whole earth as a home, close quote. Prussian nationalism was at the time as utopian as Pushkin's and Dostoevsky's later ideas must have appeared to many observers, yet our own time has seen how realistic the dreams of poets and writers can become. The enormous reservoirs of spiritual power in Russia's plain people was Dostoevsky's romantic obsession, as it was also the fervent hope that of other Russian writers, especially of Leo Tolstoy, who never tired of endowing the untutored peasant with saint-like attributes. One hears a late echo of Rousseau's praise of the beau sauvage in the elevation of the humble muzhik to the position of anonymous yet ever-present messiah. The historian Komiakov also based his messianic claims for Russia's destiny upon the quote-unquote fact that the Russians are the most humble people. And Dostoevsky later, Pan-Slavism is nothing but the logical extension of this messianic hope to the wider racial community of Eastern Europe. We now know how dangerous such pride in humility can become. Strangely enough, and in contrast to many of Tolstoy's characters, Dostoevsky's men and women are city people. Even when they live, like the Karamazovs, in the country. Dostoevsky himself was a man of the city, though his work abounds in praise of the soil and its sacramental knowledge. The composition for the disgust aroused by the human products of metropolitan decay is that great love for the plain people, which permeated his books at a time when Karl Marx spoke disdainfully of the, quote, idiocracy of rural life, close quote. Dostoevsky wrote, quote, one has to grow on the soil where the corn and trees are growing, close quote, and from which, quote, the whole order, freedom, life, honor, and family, the children, the church, in one word, everything of value comes, close quote. He believed that in this God-given order alone could grow the true communion of man. The sense of universal fellowship with all creatures, so characteristic of Dostoevsky's novel, clearly has its roots in this love for the soil, this precious Russian soil, the new Galilee pregnant with the most immediate religious expectations. Quote, the Russian people are a God-bearing people, close quote. He wrote, and it was only logical that they would expect Christ's second coming to happen in Russia. In the legend of the Grand Inquisitor, the Spaniards who kissed the soil that Jesus' feet had touched are in reality Russians. Maria Lebyatkina in The Possessed knows that the Russian soil is God's own mother, the quote-unquote prodigiously barren one. And every evening she kisses the earth when saying her prayers. The earth from which all sinners come and to which they return is a sacramental symbol. Raskolnikov kisses, quote unquote, the filthy earth in supernatural joy after confessing his crimes. Even the ethereal Mishkin, the saintly city hero of the idiot, says, quote, he who has no soils of his own has also no God, close quote. The fatherly elder Sosimo believes that atheists will only be converted by the power of the plain people and suggests to the saintly Alyosha, quote, make it a habit to fall down and kiss the earth and always love it. Love everything and everybody. Do not feel ashamed of your ecstasy, close quote. And after his advisor's death, Alyosha follows this counsel in unrestrained enthusiasm. Without wanting to reflect on his own action, he kissed the earth, sobbing silently, drenched in his own tears. He was beyond himself and vowed to love the soil, love it to all eternity. Even the death of the revered elder is nothing but an embrace of the soil. The old man slipped off the chair, spreading his arms, quote, as though he were kissing the soil in joyful ecstasy, close quote. Dostoevsky is, of course, not the only one to praise the Russian soil. There are, for example, scenes in Tolstoy's stories reminiscent of the same attitude, parentheses, Father Sergius, close parentheses. And while his reverence carries a note of pantheism, it ranks high above the later blood and soil paganism of the Nazis. In fact, I just got to say the Nazis were Catholic. In fact, it has some of the poetic traits we find associated with the saints like Saint Francis of Assisi. Makar in Raw Youth praises the leaves of grass, God's quote-unquote little grass, God's children. Everything belongs to God. There are mysterious bonds with God's other words from which the seeds have been taken for our own garden of life. And only reverence and a thankful heart will understand the puzzle of our existence within God's mysterious design. Everything is part of it. And when Alyosha falls asleep in a coffin of his departed spiritual father Zosimov, at the coffin, quote, a vast dome of heaven covered with the silent glittering stars and the Milky Way reaching from one end of the universe to the other were becoming an absolute evidence that he belonged to both worlds, the visible of man and the invisible one of God. The egotism of the I shrinks to the nothingness in view of the cosmic grandeur, and the we replaces it with the knowledge that the Russian people as a body also have a God-given destiny. In Dostoevsky's thinking, the soil not only produces the beauty of Russia and the fruits of her labor, but it also is one element that ties all Russians together in their sight of God. The rich and the poor, the learned and the virtuous are all part of the sacramental community. The soil has kept them together in spite of unbearable political and social tensions. Miracles abound in this land, and God is at work in his own ways. No wonder that bold hopes attach themselves to a belief in God's own intervention, such as aroused from the childlike faith of the early Christians. The kingdom of God will be established after the second coming of Christ, a new order for which especially the landless peasants were waiting, an order, quote, which will be entirely different, close quote. Quote, our Father, close quote. The opening words of the Lord's Prayer are a prophetic petition, as Nicholas Berdiev once explained. Someday God will actually be the father of the divided mankind, and Moscow will be the third Rome, the spiritual center of all believers everywhere. Such ultimate hopes